full name is Troy Watanabe. I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, actually, in 1964.
Thank you. And tell me a little bit about your story and your upbringing.
My story?
Yeah.
My story is just a dull one. No. I was born, like I said, born here in Salt Lake, raised in unincorporated Salt Lake, so I guess it would be called the Mill Creek area now. Just a wonderful life, I would say, growing up. Very involved in the Japanese community. My mother and father met actually through the Salt Lake Buddhist temple. My mother was originally from Orem. Her family came from her dad was a miner, and then they had 8 children, and they were in Carbon County, and because of the war, they lost their jobs, and he had to go find a migrant farming job in Orem, and that's where they ended up settling. My dad's family came from California because of the war. They were put in camps, and then after the camps, they came to Salt Lake City through a nanny. So my grandfather on my dad's side was a famous floral designer from Japan who came to America to start flower shops and show the people. He did flowers for Hollywood movies. So then they wanted those. It was funny that he did them for Hollywood movies, but they're in black and white. They wanted this guy to do these wonderful flower arrangements, but they're all in black and white, so that's kind of dumb. But they brought him in, and then he started flower shops. He had 5 flower shops in California and Southern California. And then when the war came, of course, they took those away and they moved them into a camp. But at the time they had a nanny, and my dad was born just before the war started. And she was from Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah. And there was a large flower company in Utah, florist, called Brown Floral. And she was the granddaughter of one of the Browns, and she would write letters to them when they were in camp, and then when the war ended, they got out of camp and came here because she promised them a job. And so my grandfather became the head floral designer at Brown Floral, and my grandmother became the head floral designer at ZCMI. And ZCMI is the old Macy's bought ZCMI, but it's the old big Mormon department store, I guess. And they had a fresh flower shop, and she ran that for many, many years. So, but my father and mother met at a dance at the Salt Lake Buddhist temple. My dad was sort of the rebel, the West Side boy, they called him, with the leather jacket, the cigarettes rolled up in your sleeve, and my mother was just a wholesome girl, I guess. She met the rebel. They had me. They got married when did they get married? They got married early 1964, and I was born in the end of 1964. So I was what they call a honeymoon baby.
Yeah.
Right away. Very involved in the Salt Lake Buddhist Church since I was a child. In fact, when I was 19 or 18, when I graduated high school, we do this thing every year for what we call perfect attendance for our Sunday school, or Dharma school as we call it. I had 19 years of perfect attendance when I was, just turning, after I would have been 19 that year. And I said, how did I get 19 years of perfect attendance? And they tell the story that when I was a baby, they gave it to me too, and because my mother would bring me just as soon as I was born to the church. I said, wow, I got perfect attendance as a baby. But back then, this whole area in Salt Lake, downtown, First South, between Second West and I would say, well, the Salt Palace was built, or was being built at that time, so but Third South, Second South, First South, that whole area still had some Japanese shops. And I would go from the age of about 6 years old to the Salt Lake Buddhist Temple for Japanese school lessons. We called it J School. And it's funny because we got to run around this. I mean, from Saturday morning, I would get to the church at 9 o'clock, and we would be there till about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And we would go in the morning and learn some language and some culture. And then it seemed like we had a lot of free time, because I just remember walking around the blocks, going into the Japanese. There was a market right at the corner of 2nd South and 3rd West, where the Greek Orthodox parking lot is now. And it was called Thai's Market. And Thai used to he had a deli. He made sandwiches, which was funny. And then hot soup and Japanese ramen kind of stuff and things like that, little Japanese pastries. And we would go in and buy sodas and Japanese sodas and a sandwich, which I thought was odd for a Japanese guy to have, but it was fun. And we would go around. There was an Eagle Laundry on First South, and we would go in there. It was run by some awesome Japanese businessmen that would just let us. I mean, we used to call them they were like the Rat Pack, you know, kind of that Dean Martin kind of. They were that for us. They were the old guys that were really cool, that would have the drawer with the bottle of whiskey in it and that kind of thing. And we would go in, and they had the best soda machine, and we would, you know, get sodas for. It's funny. I think it was 15 cents. I remember, and then it went up to. I remember when it went up to a quarter. I was so sad. But they would have a drawer full of money and give us the money, and we would put it in. And then there were apartment complexes directly across from the Salt Lake Buddhist temple, and it was called Whitmore Court. In fact, my aunts, when they first moved up from Orem, my mother's sisters, her older sisters, that's where they first got their apartment. They all lived together. And we used to play. I didn't know when they lived there, but we used to play around in the balconies and stuff, and it was still had quite a few Japanese people that lived there, and it was a lot of fun. And then a gas station on the corner called Pee Wee's Market, and he would chase us off all the time, Pee Wee. I don't know why. We seemed to get on his nerves quite a bit, but it was a really skinny Japanese guy. And Pee Wee, I guess he was actually Pee Wee. But he was fun. You know, I didn't even know I was Japanese. I used to think I was actually African American or black, just because the influences of my mother's music, and she used to listen to all the black artists, and my favorites were the black artists growing up as a teenager. I always, you know, so about 7 or 8, I thought I was a black guy. I found out I wasn't. From my neighborhood friends, they said, "You're not black." I said, "I am too. My parents adopted me." But no, it was, you know, and really didn't know much about being Japanese, other than because I thought everyone just figured I was, and that's who I am. And not till I was in junior high school, we used to take the bus. My whole friend group used to take the buses up here to the malls, or the department stores on Main Street, and walk around and stuff. And I remember being around the CCMI Center, before it was the CCMI Center, and walking around on South Temple, and a bunch of kids were walking by us. We're probably all about the same age, and somebody called me a Chinaman, you know, in a bad word, chink. And I remember my Chinese friend, because I had a Chinese friend with me, and he went and tackled the kid and said, "He's not a chink, he's a Jap." You know, and I just laughed, because I said, I'm not one of those either. So, you know, I remember that was the time I had a conversation with my parents about, because I had never heard the term Jap. I really didn't know it was a derogatory term. You know, and then they told me their stories of how they grew up being called these derogatory terms. Because in Utah, I really didn't feel the racism until I was older. I didn't know what racism was till I was older. Because where I grew up, they treated me the same as all of them, you know. I didn't even know. I was in 8th grade or 9th grade, and I didn't even know what a stake center was, a Mormon stake center, until I was in the 9th grade. I was invited to a dance, a Christmas dance, at a stake center, and I told my mother and father, I said, "How can they have a dance at the Sizzler? That's the weirdest thing. Why would they have a dance at the Sizzler?" And my mom said, "Not a steak restaurant, a steak center." I said, "I have no idea what that means." And she said, "You know those places you went to with your friends to primary?" She said, they all have one big church where they meet. I said, "Oh, okay." Yeah, that was odd. So, yeah, so growing up Japanese in Salt Lake really wasn't a thing for me until I got older. Then joined the Asian Association at the University of Utah and really got involved in all that. And then found out there was a lot of politics that played into it. My father were very involved, and my dad spent a lot of time there when he was younger. So I heard of all the stories of where the hotels were. In fact, there was a hotel called the Continental Hotel that was right where the Salt Palace is, right across from our church. I mean, if you went directly east from our church, there was a hotel called the Continental, and that's where all the Japanese people did their weddings and their everything, and I've seen pictures, and it's awesome, you know. And I go to Japantowns everywhere else in the United States, especially on the West Coast, and just imagining what it looked like then. Because as a kid, I remember some of the old buildings. We used to play in the old church. The Salt Lake Buddhist temple used to be farther west of where we are now, and it was we have a picture of it in our lobby, but it was hard to believe that we put a building of that size on that where our parking lot is now. But I remember it being 3 floors, the basement where I used to take judo, the main floor where they did the services, and then the upstairs is where the minister used to live. So, and in the back was a little crematorium. So, and we used to, in fact, they didn't tear that down until the late 70s, so I was, or mid 70s, when I was a teenager. And I remember locking younger kids, my brother, in there, saying, "There's ghosts in there, and this is where they used to burn people to ashes," you know, and they were like, "Ah!" But yeah. But just to think of those buildings, they were awesome buildings.
So do you remember the demolition of some of those businesses?
I do remember the demolition of our church, our old church.
Okay.
That was first. Well, Whitmore Court, I remember when that went down. I was young, but I remember when they took the apartments down.
Yeah.
And I don't know why they took those down, because they didn't do the Salt Palace expansion or anything. It was just empty. We could see all the way to South Temple, so I don't know why they did that. But then I would say right east of or west of that was Eagle Laundry, and Eagle Laundry was the dry cleaners, and you know, they did laundry, but that was where I told you that the Japanese guys that owned that were just, they were our, I don't know, our cartel, I guess. We thought they were, but I remember when that went down, and that was very sad. I'll bet that wasn't taken down until the late 70s or early 80s, 1980, because it was still there when I was in high school, or right as I was entering high school.
Okay. So how did that impact you growing up, because you're so connected to all those spaces?
Well, it was sad to see, because I knew the family that owned it, and my best friend is actually one of the grandkids, so it was a very sad thing that we used to say that Kei Terashima was his name, and Ichiro Doi lost their business, or they had to close it down. But they were very successful from it, and in fact, I never realized how old they were, but they were old, and they retired. But I do know that they were sad, but then they spent a lot of time at the church. Our church looked a lot different inside than it does now. Our kitchen used to be half the size. There was another room that we used to call the old man's room. It was our work room for making pastries or things, but also we used to have old movie nights, Japanese movies. So they'd play a comedy type Japanese movie or a modern movie at the time. So this was 1980s modern or 1970s modern. And they'd have the big projectors with the reels, and they'd put them on, and they did that up until I was in high school. But the workroom is where all those guys that had that Eagle Laundry. So even when that went down, that used to be where they congregated. They'd congregate now in the church in the workroom, and they'd drink their whiskey, smoke their cigars. And then the second movie would play, which was always like a samurai movie. And those were always Japanese samurai movies. You know, a lot of international movies, there's no ratings, so you know, they'd show a little nudity, and they'd cut people's heads off. You know, it'd be fun for us as kids to like, oh, we're sneaking, you know, and then there was always a sliding door window, which was funny, from the workroom to the kitchen. We used to say it so that the old Japanese guys could yell at the women in the kitchen and go, "I need another thing," or "I need this," or "Give me some more food," you know. We weren't sure what that was for, but we would always go in the kitchen and sneak it open a little bit, because it was always dark for the movies, so then we could see what they were doing in the workroom, because that was the only light, so we could see what they were playing cards or. But yeah, I'm sad that is all gone. That was my favorite part of watching. You know, it's just Japanese American culture, I thought, but when I went to Japan, it's the same. I think it's just an age culture, because old people now, older people in Japan now are similar to those people that I remember.
Yeah.
And they do the same thing. They hide out in the back alleys and play their games. And
Yeah. So did you ever have a moment that a realization that you are from a different culture once you went to school after high school?
just junior high. Junior high is where it all hit me. And then I had a wonderful geography teacher in ninth grade. His name was Mr. Osmond, and he taught us, probably was the best influence of world cultures. And anybody who was in our classes that was of a different culture was encouraged to do reports on that culture, to investigate it ourselves and share it with the rest of the class. So we'd have a whole week of it. So, and I guess the area I grew up in, it used to be the old Japanese farming district. So I went to school with a lot of Japanese people anyway. So in my class, I had 3 Japanese people, which I thought was big for a white junior high in Utah. And we did the same, we worked on it together, and we, the whole week we got to share reports on, each one of us did a report on like where we were from in Japan, what the culture from Japan is. We got to share food, we got to do dances and share some of the music, and it was a lot of fun.
Nice. Yeah.
It was an awesome teacher.
I think your teachers make such an impact. Like when you have a teacher like that.
But like I said, I also dealt with that was the first time I ever dealt with racism, and I didn't know that was a thing. I mean, in a way it was nice growing up in Utah because I was a little sheltered from it, but at the same time it was sort of a shock when it happened. Like I said, when we ran into that, and then I talked to my parents about it, they said, oh, it happens everywhere. And it started to happen everywhere as I got older. Yeah.
So, in terms of your kids, do you feel like they're as connected with their culture?
It's funny because I married a Caucasian lady, and my kids are half Japanese, half Caucasian. But I think my kids are more culturally Japanese than I was growing up. We bring them to the church, and we have a lot of cultural activities now. But my daughter looks more Asian than my sons. I have twin sons who are 16, and they don't look as Asian. But they're all culturally, I don't know, it's hard to explain. I mean, they pronounce the words better than I do. They speak better than I do. They took Japanese in school. My daughter's taking it up at the U. They've been more times than I have been, so it's kind of hard. I don't know. They love the culture, and I think they're even more accepted at school than I was. I don't know. It's kind of hard to say.
Really interesting. Do you feel like if we had that original Japantown, that would have changed the narrative of our city?
I think it definitely would have.
Yeah.
It definitely would have. But you have to remember, Salt Lake City, anything west of West Temple that was the border of the bad part of town. That's where, like, the slums, so to speak.
Right.
So that's why that was allowed to be Japantown way back before the war and everything, because the businesses were from North Temple to Second South, West Temple to Third West. And that was, when I look at the old pictures of it, to me it looks dirty, but yet it still was beautiful in a way that, it was a cultural area. And I think now it would be wonderful to have that, but we don't have it, so.
Do you know if a lot of people are aware about it, or do you feel like most people are just...
I don't think there's groups of people. So my father-in-law, who passed away 3 years ago, he was 93, I would call him the true downtown Salt Lake City resident. He grew up in the Avenues. His mother worked downtown. He worked downtown all his life. He worked for the phone company. World War II vet. In fact, he guarded the China-Burma-India Road against the Japanese soldiers. It's funny.
Yeah.
And I ended up, I remember asking for his daughter's hand in marriage, and he just laughed. Just said, oh yeah, I used to kill your people. You did? Don't kill my people. You used to go to my neighborhood and kill my people? He said, no. He was trying to make a joke, but I put it back. But he truly was the one, he used to talk about Japantown. He used to talk about Plum Alley, where the Chinatown was. He used to talk about that whole, he knew all of that. And he was sad to see that go. In fact, he was very good friends of Harry Louis, who's a Chinese man whose family, Harry Louis' parents, started their restaurant in Plum Alley. And then it moved across the street on State Street, and then it moved to 3rd South and just east of State Street, or west of State Street. And my father-in-law tells the stories of helping him move those restaurants and putting his phone lines in for him. And so that culture, that era, that age group remembers downtown Salt Lake really well. And I think they think of it fondly. But there's a whole group, my age group even, didn't know there was a Japantown, you know. A lot of my friends that I went to high school with are surprised. You know, they contacted me on Facebook or something after all those articles came out in the Salt Lake Tribune about Japantown or Block 67 Japantown, and they're all like, was there a Japantown? You know, and yeah, there was.
Why do you think that that shift in, you know, the visibility of the communities in our city has kind of just, why do you think that happened? Like, why do you think it's so gone? Do you think it's...
Well, I just think it's urban sprawl. I think it's just, you know, you're building, and the connection, you know, we like to say we're connected, and we are. We're all still connected. But when the city wants to expand, and at that time, they weren't thinking we're going to push the Japanese out, we're going to push the Chinese out. It was a time for developers to be able to say, oh, look, we can get property here, you know, maybe not on the cheap, but for fair market value and not have to go higher. Somebody's not going to, and they had the opportunities. It's just the way cities grow. I mean, it wasn't. A lot of people, like even in some of these articles, are trying to say, oh, it was the city pushed us out. I have Japanese people in our community now that are saying, oh yeah, they pushed us out, but others are saying, no, they didn't push us out, you know. So it's kind of hard. It's where your emotions are. But I think we are losing that cultural group, but at the same time, nobody knew about that cultural group except for that cultural group, and maybe the people that lived around them. So we're not losing that. I think we're helping to gain recognition of it more now because of those things, you know. And it's just like our development on Block 67, where our church is right now, the Ritchie Group, had no idea that was a Japantown. You know, the master plan, the master city plan, or on the county plan, that block doesn't list anything that there was a Japantown. In fact, when the Salt Palace built, that wasn't even a Japantown on their master plan. So, I mean, if it would have been designated, then it could be protected. In fact, the Ritchie Group is working with us to get that on the new master plan, so that any other developments, you know, or any other buildings or things that go on into that block will help honor through architecture or landscaping. Yeah.
So it seems like they've been very cooperative and open to...
I think they've been very cooperative.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, as a developer, it's hard to say, look at this, I found this property, and then start your grand plan of something wonderful, and then get investors involved and be into it a year into the process, and then find out that this was a Japantown. And there's a cultural group that's like against you. I think it's also our natural human nature to not trust developers. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, they have a stigma, like...
They do. Well, they're the bad guys because they're coming in and doing this. Yeah. But, you know, without the developers, we wouldn't have what we have. Right. So I think the Ritchie Group's been wonderful as far as working with us. There might be some in our community say no, and that's what we're trying to get across now. We have this Japantown working group, and we're really working with the city, the county, and the developer to try to make the recognition of First South. In fact, the developer doesn't even have to be involved in that.